Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie. Today's video is just going to be a March reading wrap up. I'm eating cereal at the same time. So the first books that I finished in March, I finished on the same day, but I actually do think I finished this first even though I'd been reading this longer. I just started this like over Shabbos, I think, and then I finished it on the first, which was the day of Shabbos, and then after that I tried to finish this on purpose. But I think I'll just talk about this first because I made a big video, like a long video, about it and about my like thoughts and feelings about reading it and stuff, because like on the surface this seems like the kind of perfect book for me, like in terms of the historical setting and the particular kind of ideas it takes up, but then there's a way that like it just kind of misses the mark for me in lots of ways, and like some of that has to do with like the fact that it is positioned so kind of closely to what I research, but then it doesn't include like any of the women that I look at except from like the most famous socialist children's writer, and even then like she's not actually in it because the main character of this novel is based off of her. But yeah, so like this is quite like a large book full of lots of different characters, but I would say like one of the revolving centres of it, although she does dissipate a lot nearer the end, but like is through this children's writer who writes like fantastical fiction called Olive Wellwood, who has like a really large family, and yeah, she's a socialist. Through her figure there's like a discussion about like writing and producing like art, and also thinking about like children's stories and fantasy and fairy tales, and then also the book is also thinking about like other forms of creating and making and kind of like somewhat like unalienated forms of labour, but also it's like very much thinking about like the arts and crafts movement. And yeah, so it starts in the kind of 1890s and it goes on into the 1900s, into the 20th century, looking at these various like families and characters. And you know, so there's one other kind of key point I would say, who's a like working class child who loves pottery, and so he becomes like an apprentice to this like very megalomaniac, is that the right term for him? Anyway, this like very kind of like intense, like very like artistic in that kind of like very abusive man kind of way, potter, and through that he becomes like a potter too, and like so there's also a focus on creating in that sense. And then there's also a kind of lesser focused on aspect of creating, which is puppetry, which also I guess really feeds into this idea of like thinking about like fantasy, thinking about like stories for children and how they might be different, but also thinking about how stories for children are what adults want and need to. So yeah, like I said, like one of the things I was like delighted by was it's like focused on like socialist culture and socialist like production, making, a community, but I also feel like it kind of fell short in lots of ways. And I also feel like unfortunately the book, even though in a way it felt like it was writing against that, it sort of did ultimately like prioritize the middle class characters over the working class, especially like the working class women characters in this. Yeah, so like a mixed bag, but I think I did ultimately give it like 4 stars or something, so like it is still a good book. It's worth reading, I think, if you're like interested in this. I just felt like there were so many gaps where I thought that my women could have been included and they weren't, that it made me like kind of sad in that sense. I will leave a link to that video where I talk about it way more in depth if you're interested or have read it. Then yeah, the other book that I finished on the 1st of March was Heavyweight, A Family Story of the Holocaust, Empire and Memory by Solomon J. Brager, which is a black and white graphic non-fiction graphic memoir family history book. I actually did kind of want to reread it, to be honest, but partially because I wanted to go through and write a list of all of the references that it makes, because it's very like well researched, well cited. There's like notes with references and also sometimes more information, and I thought this was like fantastic. I think as a piece of work that grapples with the Holocaust and with memory and also with history itself, I just thought it was like very full of like integrity and conscientious, and I'd really recommend it just in general. I also think the way that it like refuses to isolate the Holocaust as this one singular act of like human depravity, of course it is that, but it's not a singular act in the sense that the logic of it, the kind of like rehearsals for it, and also that the proximity to violence that Jews have and have experienced isn't only isolated to Jewish experience either, you know. Whilst I think the character of anti-Semitic violence is different from other violences, the part that they overlap in is that it's violence, you know, like violence against the Herero people, violence against Roma and Sinti, violence against refugees, like so on. I guess like the kind of crux of the book is, well, there's two kind of major points. One of them is based off of the title, is about Solomon J. Brager's kind of like obsession, I guess, with a family member, like a German Jewish family member who was a boxer in the like 1920s, 1930s, called Eric. I would say like one of my criticisms of this book, even though I did still give it like 5 stars, is just that like some of it gets a little confusing, and there's also 2 family members, if I'm correct, who are called Eric. Now I can't find the second Eric. I'm pretty sure that's right though. But there is this family tree that you can refer back to, but I also find it's kind of a confusing family tree because it's almost like too squished together. But anyway, yeah, so that's one kind of strand. And then the secondary strand is that Solomon J. Brager's like great grandma, I think, Ilse Joan Leeds, or Gertrude Ilse Kahn, she did a testimony about her experience of surviving the Holocaust with the like Shoah Foundation, and so it's also kind of about like grappling with that as an institutional record of Holocaust history, but also being simultaneously kind of frustrated with the like vagueness of some of it, with the like gaps that are clearly present in it. And so as a book, it also is really thinking about like the preservation of histories, of oral history and oral testimony, and like how that can shape how you imagine events, even if it's not necessarily super accurate. And I don't think this is denigrating the collecting of like oral history and like interviews and testimony from survivors of various events, but obviously specifically the Holocaust in this. But it is saying like as a kind of historical methodology, like there are limitations to it as a form, and I thought that was also just really, really fascinating. I just love this like a lot. I think it's really, really excellent. Yeah, there's also some specific stuff related to Roma and Sinti persecution during the Nazi like period that I thought was like really important to learn about, that I don't think I ever learned anything really about Roma, and like at school when I was learning about the Holocaust, like I don't think I ever really learned anything about Roma and Sinti genocide, and I think that's really like awful, and I think that's part and parcel with the way that like Roma and Sinti lives have continued to be treated to this day, you know, because Eric is this boxer. There's also a kind of contextualizing of him with like other boxers of the time, and one of the boxers that is spoken about is Johann Rukeli Trollman, who was the Sinti boxer, who honestly I just kind of want to weep for, but like he was, you know, criticized in the German press for like not being German in his boxing style because he danced in the ring in a way that they like racialized, so then in one of his next fights, you know, he like bleached his hair blonde and he stood and he painted his face white and he stood like still in the ring and like got knocked out, because that's, you know, how a good German would box, you know, like the Aryan way, which is just such an iconic thing to do. Yeah, I mean, his family story is really, really sad, and I can leave links to some stuff I read about him in the description if you're interested. Yeah, I mean, I could almost talk about this forever because there's so much to kind of take away from it. There's also definitely a sense of humour in it, which I think was really lovely. There's this one bit which I couldn't find when I was looking through it. It's where like Solomon and their like partner, their boyfriend, Charles, is like they're like sitting together or something, and Charles is being very sweet and it's just like, you know, I'm just thinking about how handsome you are, and then Solomon's just like, I'm thinking about Nazis. Yeah, and I mean, like, to continue on talking about like Roma and Sinti stuff, I would also say that this like kind of looks at the way that Roma and Sinti stories and like Holocaust experiences have been erased / like purposefully kind of left out of the record in terms of the like oral testimonies and the interviews taken by things like the Shoah Foundation, because they were kind of consistently like not asked about. Like the interviewees, there's like this whole page about it, which I bet I won't be able to find now, because there was such a like prejudice against like Roman people, especially I guess in Germany, but not limited to Germany for sure. There's I'll just read this quote. So there's a bit that is quoted in this by historian Ari Yoskowitz, who writes, although most interviewers were trained to ask for names and details, They rarely inquired after the names of the Romanis mentioned in their interviews, reinforcing a narrative tradition in which individual Roma became anonymous gypsies. So yeah, just really good, and I'll cut myself off. It seems like I've been recording for 20 minutes, but that cannot be right. The next book I finished, which I can probably talk about quick, so that's good, is The Slippery Slope by Lemony Snicket, which is the 10th in the A Series of Unfortunate Events series. Really churning through them now. Like I've said many times before when I've been reading this. I'm reading this series with my friend Mari, who is rereading it, and I'm reading it for the first time, but I have watched the TV show. Yeah, this one I did pretty much enjoy. We're getting like a lot of answers. We're getting a lot of like, instead of just kind of hints at the mystery and like hints at information, we're actually getting information at this point. So that's nice. That sometimes it feels maybe a little bit clunky, or like suddenly there's just like a deluge of information. But it is enjoyable. Also, I feel like there's a lot of focus on commonplace books in the latter like books of this series, and I feel like I've been seeing like stuff about commonplacing like a lot since reading them, or like it's just funny to think about them. There was like this moment where the narrative like turns away from describing what happens, and it gave Violet like a moment of privacy that I thought was really lovely. So I really like that about this one. Yeah, I do find these hard to kind of talk about singularly because they are all kind of leading together. I mean, obviously we're also like out of the pattern of the first few books where it's like they go to a new guardian, Count Olaf finds them, and then they try to convince the guardian that it's Count Olaf, but nobody believes them. So we are out of that kind of like, yeah, structure. I will say I think like I am enjoying less of the kind of like storytelling repetitions that like happen in this story. Like I've stopped enjoying those so much, but I think a child would obviously enjoy them, but yeah. Okay, the next book I read is also a book I made a whole video about actually, so I will link that too. This is The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. Yeah, I hated this book. I didn't enjoy it at all. I don't understand why people think it's a masterpiece, and I hate Henry James. Those are the ultimate conclusions. Yeah, I'm not going to talk any more about this. I don't have to. Yeah, also I will say The Portrait of a Lady, and also some of the other books that I'm about to talk about, I did talk a little bit about in the reading vlog / PhD writing vlog that I posted and was like filming throughout March. So yeah, so this is actually like a bind up of 3 books in the series. Like the series is called Out of the Hitler Time by Judith Kerr. I only read one of these stories. I read the first one, which I think is the most famous one. I feel like most people don't know that there's actually more in the series, partially because I think the audience kind of changes maybe. But yeah, so I read When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit in this, and I honestly really thought it was really good. I thought it was like very vivid. I thought it was very moving. I thought it like, yeah, I don't know, I just thought it was really good. There was like I think there was like a simultaneous way that it like grappled with like the difficulty of just like moving places, with also a focus on like the positives and the like enjoyment that Anna, the main character, experiences. And I really like the stuff that talked about language. I also like, there's this sort of running joke about like Anna learning about like great writers and how great writers had difficult childhoods, and she was like, oh, that means I'll never be a great writer because I haven't had a difficult childhood. And you kind of think she's gonna like turn around and be like, okay, no, this was actually really difficult. But in the end she's still just like, well, I can't really say my child has been that difficult, even though like it was kind of difficult to you know, move from the country you've known your whole life when you've been like 9 or something to a different one, and then also to another one, and then also to another one. Yeah, but there's something very sweet about this. I think it was really great, and I would really recommend it. I know it's very famous and most people probably have read it, but I guess if you read it as a child, it's maybe worth a reread. And also, I mean, I really want to read the other stories in this. I just feel like I have to prioritize other reading, but hopefully I'll come back to this soon and read the next one in the series, which is Bombs on Aunt Daisy. This copy has literally the worst, like, first of all, the covers are terrible, but also the font on the covers is just appalling. There are these moments where like some of the like horrors of Nazi violence comes in. Like there is a way that's like that Anna kind of like thinks about and engages with them and gets really stressed and scared, but I also felt like it was kind of contained quite nicely without saying that's okay and that's fine, you know, like it's still really sad. I think part of that is helped through the figure of her dad, who is this kind of like fairly funny character, but also who's like the one who flees first before his family, before Hitler gets elected, because he thinks he will be in trouble once Hitler is elected, because he's been writing against the Nazis and stuff, and they are Jews. So the next book I read was Liza of Lambeth by let's try that again, by W. Somerset Maugham. I think I've been saying this is about the East End of London, but like Lambeth is like in South London, isn't it? Like, I'm a fool. But we'll just like move on from that. This is like a very short book, and I did read it like pretty quickly, and I didn't really like it, but I also, well, is that totally true? I think that's kind of true, but it also actually wasn't what I expected it to be. I feel like the way I've been describing it is like, oh, and then she meets this man, and then we all know what's gonna happen next, and like to some degree, well, no, I mean, it does fall into that. I think the thing that I guess I thought is that the class dynamic between Liza and Jim, who she meets and starts this relationship with, was different. So I thought it was going to be, you know, this like middle class man showing up to the area, being new and like exciting, seducing a young woman, and then like leaving her. But that's obviously not quite the dynamic, because Jim Blakeston is working class too. But yeah, I didn't really enjoy it. There were a few times where I felt like the like idiolect, is that the right word? The like linguistic stuff with particular phrases was really interesting. There was one about like balmy on a crumpet or something, which I just like loved. But yeah, other than that, like I didn't enjoy it as a piece of fiction. Pretty tragic, but yeah. The next one I read is another Lemony Snicket. That's The Grim Grotto, so that's the 11th. This one I think I enjoyed less than The Slippery Slope, for sure. There's some like pretty sad bits in this, I guess, and also there's also quite a lot of repetition and saying and just like I was a little bored by that. And I also think like maybe Emma in her like reading vlog of reading all of these in like one 24-hour period says this too, but I feel like in this book they like try to bring in a kind of like people are morally complicated and, you know, blah blah blah, choices, blah blah blah, but it doesn't really work. This is the 11th book, and also a lot of the ways that they're like being like, well, you set a fire, blah blah blah, but like the thing is like these children don't have the same agency as the adults who are setting a fire or like getting the children to set a fire. So for me it feels very like foolish to be being like, that's kind of morally on the same level, and it makes me very sad when like these children take responsibility for sort of like doing evil when like they haven't done any evil really, and the evil that they participated in was literally out of necessity to protect themselves, even if it didn't work. It's just not the same, you know. Like, okay, I just got 2 more, which I think I finished on the same day, so did a lot of double day finished books in March. The first one I read this really quite fast. I think I read it in like 2 days. This is Private Rights by Julia Armfield. I think I'm kind of destined like not to really like love Julia Armfield, and part of that is maybe the sort of queer hype she gets, but also she just isn't really writing books that are like my kind of books, even if there are bits of them that I find like enjoyable or that I like or I'm interested in. But yeah, for me, like, I didn't find Our Wives Under the Sea particularly convincing, and I felt the same way with this, especially, I mean, the ending I just thought was like pretty terrible. Like, it just ramped up so fast in a way that was like, you know, you kind of did know it was coming, but it was also like, if you were going to do that, then you should have developed it like actually more strongly and a bit earlier. I was talking with someone on Instagram who had read it, and we were just talking about how like the blurb kind of missells it as this like very occult thing, when really that's a sort of like tendril that makes its way through but isn't like super present really, except from near the end. Is that a spoiler to say that? Sorry if it is. Yeah, so this book is, I guess, centered on like 3 siblings, Isla, Irene and Agnes, and Agnes is like a stepsister to them, and she's also I think like 10-11 years younger than Irene and Isla, who are 1 year apart. They have this like very famous architect father who has died recently. That's kind of where it begins, but it's also set in this world, this like future climate kind of catastrophe. It's mostly connected with flooding and raining, so the world is kind of flooded, and so this architect is like really good at like building responsive buildings, but especially like his own house, which looms large in like the sisters' relationship and their like memories and stuff like that. Like, I am probably gonna keep reading Julia Armfield, even if she kind of misses the mark for me every time, but like that's partially because I really like the way that she represents or like thinks about adult queer women and their relationships, like, which I don't feel is particularly present elsewhere, and I do like that. I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with how she sometimes writes about like sex within that too, but like I imagine that there is a kind of reader who would love this, and that's not me. I would say my like kind of ambivalence around Julia Armfield's work is because she does really like horror as like a genre, like horror films I would say, like almost especially, but like that's just not something I particularly enjoy. But it's just like not a kind of mode of like imagining that I'm particularly like interested in, and I think obviously she is, and so it comes out in her fiction, which doesn't tend to be like 100% horror anyway, but like has these like threads of it. Yeah, I think ultimately I probably did like Our Eyes Under the Sea more than this, but I'm not actually sure, and I don't remember what I gave it. I also, in a hilarious turn of events, I'm pretty sure I liked her short stories more than I like her novels. I definitely would be interested to know if you've read this and what you thought about it. The other thing I read was not the thing that I meant to read from the Republic of Consciousness Prize. It was another thing from that shortlist, but I read it, and obviously I do have this like goal of reading like French books this year, I guess, or like translated from French books, but like this is a new book, so oh yeah, but I will say like I do plan to read the book that won the Republic of Consciousness Prize UK, which is called like There Is a Monster in the House or something. I'll put a picture of it here. I just I'm not buying any books in April, but in May I'm gonna get that. But yeah, so I read Selena by Catherine Axelrad, translated by Philip Terry, which is a kind of ventriloquizing for this woman who, or this teenage girl, who was a like chambermaid slash servant for Victor Hugo whilst he lived in Guernsey, is that right? In that like really intense house he like built in like the 1850s, 1860s. I think it follows like 2 years of her life or something. It's very, you know, slim. It wasn't really what I expected. In some way I felt like it was going to be like stronger. Like I felt like Selena's voice was going to be much more strong, because it was like she was trying to, like the author was trying to kind of like put back the sort of agency and the voice of this working class woman slash girl. So I was kind of expecting her to have like real character in that sense, and I don't think she did. But that's not to say I don't think she had a character, but I just feel like I went in with these assumptions about her, or about how she was going to be represented, and instead it's a lot softer than that, and there are parts that are very sweet. I think I was ultimately underwhelmed, and I do kind of feel a bit like, what was the point of that? But then I also, you know, clearly feeling very ambivalent today. So like, you know, I also am a bit like, obviously I always think that like recuperating or like restoring working class women from these like very tiny glimpses that we get into their lives is like a really important part of like historical work, and also can be like a really beautiful part of like literary and imaginative work and writing. I still kind of feel a bit like, what was the point? Would definitely be interested in other people, if other people have read this. There is also a way that there's a kind of like normalcy to not necessarily like sexual violence, even if I would say that the things that happen in this are sexually violent, but like they also are sort of so normalized that they aren't recognized as sexual violence, in a way that like the characters are not upset by them, like who it happens to. So there's a sort of level of power disparity in these gendered and classed relationships that is just so normal that it's like genuinely acceptable, and in some places sort of represented in a way that's like very sweet and kind actually, which is quite strange, but also, yeah, like an interesting tension, especially as like a modern person. Also, I suddenly realized there's some times when like the Victor Hugo person in this, he's like sad about being like exiled from France, and I realized that like I knew it was Victor Hugo, and there's like references to Les Miserables and stuff like that, but like I was imagining that he was also kind of Zola at that point, who obviously like is kind of an icon. I say that because of his like supporting Dreyfus and stuff like that, and like Jacques and stuff like that. But anyway, like instead I realized it was Victor Hugo, who's not the same person at all, and I don't actually know why Victor Hugo was like exiled from France. Actually, I guess it was maybe because he was a Republican? ? Anyway, I guess this is like an interesting exercise. I didn't think it was particularly great. Okay, that is everything that I read. If you are okay to bear with me, I am going to talk a little bit about like my April reading plans. So Katie from Books and Things is hosting like the TBR Clearout readathon, and I just I'm aiming to read between 30 and 40% books that were on my TBR before 2025 this year, so I would love to read more of my TBR. I feel like I'm doing well. I think so far I've read about 30%, so that is good and that's like successful, but you know, want to keep going. So I was like, yeah, looking at her TBR, clearout readathon, and also the like prompts and stuff she has. There's one prompt which is like set how many books you want to read. I'm not going to do that, but there's also prompts long time why did I write that like that? The longest book the book that's been on your TBR for the longest, there we go. The book that most recently was added to your TBR, the longest book on your TBR, shortest book on your TBR, lost interest in book, and very excited to read. I won't tell you like specifically what these things cover because it doesn't really matter. But I have started reading 2 books which are on my spring TBR, which I have made some headway with from my March reading, so that's good. So this is Maman, What Are We Called Now by Jacqueline Maslin-Amal, translated by Francine York. And this is What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen. So I've started both of those, and both of these are like long-term like books that have been on my TBR for a long time, so that would be great. Then I have some other options. 3 books that I've more recently added to my TBR are Mother Naked by Glenn James Brown, which was on the Republic of Consciousness shortlist, and I did really want to read before, like the long list was announced, but I didn't get to it. And this is probably one of the most recent books that I got. I actually did just receive this book in the post. Like, I didn't buy it in April, but it arrived in April. But I'm not counting it because this is more like for my PhD stuff. But this is Keynotes and Discourse by George Editon. But this is In the Blink of an Eye by Ali Bacon, which is set in 1814. It is 1840, I mean, like 1843, and it's about like photography and stuff. Like, I've wanted to read it for ages and I saw it for fairly cheap on eBay, so I bought it. I also would like to read Sultana's Dream by Begum Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain, which is a short story that was published in a periodical, and is kind of like a utopian one, and also this edition has like these nice drawings. So yeah, I'd love to read this. Also, this is really short, so I would think this counts for the shortest on my TBR. I also would like to read Body of Glass by Marge Piercy. Don't know if I will read it this month, but I just thought I'd include it. I might read it in May. I don't know. It would be nice to read something Jewish that isn't Holocaust specifically related. Then I've got this book, which was in my spring reading TBR plan. That's Kingdoms of Elfin by Sylvia Townsend Warner. This is like short stories, so if I could read like one short story, that's very low, but like let's just say one short story, fine. If I could start it, that would be great. And then I've got When Foxes a Thousand by Larissa Lai, which is a novel that I'm really excited to get to. I just like, you know, it's one of those things that just gets pushed back, and then on the day when you like have finished a book, you don't actually feel in the mood to pick this one up, but you like do want to read it, blah blah blah. And then another book as well is Dictee by Teresa Hack Kyung Cha, which was in my spring TBR, I'm pretty sure, so it would be great to get to this. And also this one's quite short too. So yeah, breeze through those as fast as possible. I think that's like everything I had to say. Thank you so much for watching. Definitely let me know how your March reading has gone. There'll be a link in my description box to a GoFundMe to help Ala and her family whilst they're stuck in Gaza. If you'd like to check that out, I would be grateful. Yeah, I will talk to you when I next talk to you.